Because if you cannot lead yourself, if your thoughts, habits, choices, your failures and ambitions remain undisciplined, no number of titles, teams or followers will deliver real. The distinction between leading others and leading yourself is not as obvious as most people think. It's easy to confuse management with leadership, and even easier to mistake external influence for internal control. But the truth is, leadership begins inside. Before you can manage people, before you can inspire action or make decisions that affect others, you have to have command of yourself, your emotions, your thinking, your habits, and your decision-making under pressure. You have to become someone others would naturally want to follow, not because they're told to, but because they see clarity, consistency, and competence in how you conduct yourself. Leading yourself is the foundation. It means being honest about what you know and what you don't know. It means developing the discipline to act when it's hard and restraining yourself when your emotions want to take over. You learn how to respond rather than react. You build systems for how you approach problems, how you process setbacks, and how you stay focused on long-term goals in the face of short-term distractions. This doesn't come naturally, you earn it. You shape it through struggle, failure, reflection, and iteration. On the other side is leading others, where the job changes. You now become responsible not only for outcomes, but for people. And people don't respond well to control or pretense. They respond to clarity. They respond to alignment. They want to know that you're not just telling them what to do. You're showing them how to think. That you're not just delegating tasks. You're building trust. And the only way you can do that sustainably is if you've already developed clarity within yourself. People can sense confusion. They can sense fear. They can sense uncertainty that's not addressed. When you haven't done the work internally, it will show up in your external leadership. Every single time. The difference is that leading others requires vision, communication, and trust. But those things can't exist without personal discipline and self-mastery. You cannot lead a team through chaos if you haven't figured out how to lead yourself through chaos. If your internal systems break under pressure, so will your leadership. Leading others is less about giving instructions and more about creating an environment where people feel empowered to think, act, and grow. That only happens when they trust that the person guiding them is grounded and focused. Many people make the mistake of seeking authority before they've built the habits that make them credible. They want the position before they've proven the discipline. That always backfires. Leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about being responsible. You're responsible for your team, yes, but also for your energy, your consistency, and your clarity under stress. You don't get that from a title. You get it from practicing over and over how to lead yourself, how to think in a structured way, how to separate fact from emotion, how to align your actions with your principles even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. When people look to a leader, they're looking for signals. They're asking, can this person be trusted? Are they consistent? Do they really believe in what they're saying? Are they anchored, or are they reacting like everyone else? And those answers come not from words, but from presence, from how you show up in meetings, from how you speak under pressure, from whether you listen, adjust, and learn, from whether you can take accountability without deflecting blame. These are all elements of leading yourself. You don't build those traits overnight. You build them over years. You build them by being honest with yourself when you fail. By recognizing that no matter how smart or talented you are, your ego will always try to protect you from truth. And it's your job to override that, to confront reality, to face uncomfortable feedback, to learn from people who are better than you in areas where you're weak. That's the work, and that work never ends. So the actual difference between leading others and leading yourself isn't really a difference at all, it's a sequence. One precedes the other. You lead yourself first, and by doing so, you become someone who is capable of leading others with clarity, confidence, and integrity. Without that, no structure or strategy will be enough. Because people don't follow plans, they follow people. And people who lead themselves well are the only ones truly qualified to lead others. Most people approach leadership from the outside in. They focus on strategies, techniques, influence tactics, and organizational structures. They want to learn how to manage others, how to delegate, how to be persuasive in meetings. But the deeper reality is that these are surface-level expressions of something more fundamental. The effectiveness of your leadership is constrained by the clarity of your thinking, the accuracy of your judgment, and the consistency of your decision-making under pressure. Leadership is not a role you perform, it's an extension of how you operate, how you process the world, how you navigate complexity, uncertainty, and conflict. The difference between those who can lead well and those who cannot is not determined by charisma or style. It's determined by how they think. Can they see things as they are, not as they wish them to be? Can they separate signals from noise? Can they hold multiple conflicting ideas at once and make decisions based on principle rather than pressure? Most people can't. They respond emotionally, make reactive decisions, and then rationalize them later. That pattern of behavior will always limit how far they can go. When someone tries to lead others without addressing how they process feedback, how they deal with setbacks, or how they align their actions with reality, the cracks eventually show. And those cracks become pressure points in teams, cultures, and results. People can sense dissonance. They notice when what's said doesn't match what's done. They notice when a leader's decisions are based on self-preservation instead of truth. And when that happens, trust erodes, not instantly, but gradually and sometimes permanently. To lead well, you have to develop the capacity to see yourself clearly. You need a process for examining how you make decisions, how you respond when you're wrong, and how you interpret success. Without that, you build your leadership on a foundation of emotion and instinct, neither of which can scale. Emotion is too unstable and instinct too unpredictable. You need something more structured, more objective. When it comes to leading others, there's an even higher level of scrutiny. People don't follow because you're in charge. They follow because they believe in your clarity. They follow because they recognize that you make decisions not based on convenience, but based on what's necessary. And they'll only trust you if you consistently show that you are aligned with reality, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Too many people think leading others is about controlling outcomes or assigning tasks. That's not leadership. That's administration. Real leadership is about shaping environments, aligning teams with purpose, and creating the space for high standards to exist without being policed constantly. You do that by making sure people know what's expected, why it matters, and how they can measure themselves. And none of that is possible if the person in charge is still struggling with internal conflict, unclear principles, or reactive habits. The point isn't to be perfect, it's to be clear. When people know where you stand, when they can predict your behavior under pressure, when they understand the standards you hold for yourself, they begin to trust your leadership. And once trust is in place, performance becomes scalable, communication becomes simpler, culture becomes self-reinforcing, the organization stops depending on force and starts running on alignment. But that can't be faked. You can't skip steps. You can't demand clarity from others while operating in confusion yourself. You can't expect others to improve if you resist feedback. You can't talk about accountability while blaming circumstances. These contradictions reveal themselves over time. People notice patterns. They notice inconsistency. And the cost of pretending is that you lose the very credibility required to lead. If you want to create something that lasts, something that performs under pressure and evolves over time, then the quality of your leadership needs to match the complexity of the environment. You need to think clearly, operate objectively, and make decisions based on timeless principles, not temporary emotion. That's what sets great leadership apart from average management, and that's what allows others to trust you not just in good times, but in chaos. At the end of the day, the difference isn't about a label, it's about depth. Some people are trying to lead others with shallow understanding and fragmented thinking that never works. It may produce short-term gains, but it will collapse under weight. Others operate with clarity, self-awareness, and principle. That shows up in how they lead, who follows, and what gets built. The choice is always available, but the consequences aren't optional. Most people misunderstand what leadership really demands. They confuse authority with influence, control with clarity, and obedience with alignment. That confusion leads to fragile structures, teams that only function when watched, organizations that require constant reinforcement, and decisions made for short-term comfort rather than long-term resilience. The reality is different. You don't earn the right to lead simply because you occupy a position. You earn it by how you think, how you show up, and how consistently you make decisions that are grounded in principle rather than preference. The problem arises when people try to shortcut that process. They look for frameworks and motivational tactics, but skip the deeper work of examining how they interpret situations, how they respond under pressure, and how their decisions reflect their actual values. When that disconnect exists, you may get compliance, but you won't get commitment. People may follow your instructions, but they'll withhold their full engagement. That gap between what's being said and what's being believed is where most leadership failures live. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. Intelligence doesn't guarantee sound decisions. In fact, unchecked intelligence often leads to arrogance, and arrogance blinds you to feedback. The ability to lead others is directly tied to your capacity to understand patterns, to adapt when necessary, and to communicate without distortion. None of that happens through force. It happens through alignment between your behavior, your decisions, and the outcomes you're aiming for. That alignment can't be outsourced. It comes from your own internal operating system. You need to build systems for how you process data, for how you test assumptions, for how you decide what matters. You need to be able to tell the difference between emotional noise and objective signal. Most people can't. They let their own biases shape their view of the world, then project those distortions onto others. When that becomes habitual, you lose the ability to lead with credibility, and once credibility is lost, no amount of force or persuasion will recover it. The deeper question is not how to lead others, it's how to become the type of person others want to follow. That doesn't happen because you're charismatic or persuasive. It happens because people can see you operate in reality. They see you take responsibility when it's inconvenient. They see you act with consistency, even when no one is watching. They see that your principles don't change based on outcomes, and that consistency is what creates the conditions for trust. In environments where people are unsure of what to expect, they revert to self-protection. They avoid risk, they play small, they do the minimum required because they're not sure whether their efforts will be understood or valued. In contrast, when they operate under someone whose judgment is stable, whose process is visible, and whose behavior is aligned with stated values, they feel a different level of safety. That psychological safety isn't softness. It's clarity. It means people know what matters, what will be rewarded, and what will be held accountable. You can't create that kind of environment by barking orders or enforcing rules. You create it by modeling the standards you expect. You show people how problems are approached, how truth is prioritized, and how outcomes are evaluated. Over time, people internalize those expectations not because they've been instructed to, but because they've seen them play out consistently. And once that happens, the system starts to operate on its own momentum. It stops being about you and starts being about the shared standard that's been established. That's where leadership begins to scale. It's not tied to your presence in the room. It's embedded in how decisions are made, how conflict is resolved, and how people evaluate their own work. But you can't reach that point unless you've already done the work to become clear on what matters, why it matters, and how to act on it when stakes are high. That clarity can't be faked. It comes from repeated effort, failure, adjustment, and reflection. In the end, the ability to lead others is limited by the depth of your own self-awareness and the consistency of your own operating system. If those elements are weak, everything built on top of them becomes unstable. But if they're strong, if you've built a process for thinking clearly, making principled decisions, and responding to reality without distortion, then leadership becomes less about direction and more about creating the space where people can perform at their best. That's not just more effective, it's more durable, and durability is what separates short-term authority from long-term impact. Most people think that leadership is about giving answers. They believe that the one with the clearest voice, the strongest stance, or the most confidence will naturally lead. But what they fail to see is that those surface attributes don't build trust over time. What builds trust is clarity of thought, consistency in behavior, and the ability to face truth. No matter how inconvenient, leadership is not about looking strong, it's about being aligned with reality. That alignment isn't easy to build, and it's even harder to sustain when the pressure increases. But it's the one thing that separates those who lead with influence from those who simply manage with authority. People gravitate toward clarity. They want to know what's true, what matters, and what is expected. They don't follow you because you have a title. They follow because they've seen that your decisions are not emotionally reactive or politically motivated. They follow because your actions aren't dictated by what's popular, but by what's effective and principled. That clarity creates a structure around them. It gives them room to operate, take risks, and think without fear of being misunderstood or misjudged. That's when performance becomes scalable. The problem is that most people in leadership roles avoid that clarity. They avoid it because it requires them to be self-critical, to admit what they don't know, and to take accountability when things go wrong. It's easier to delegate blame than to reflect. It's easier to defend your choices than to examine them. But when you take that approach, you build an environment where no one gets better, because no one is allowed to be wrong. Progress stalls, innovation dries up, and mediocrity becomes normalized. You can't expect other people to grow if you're unwilling to confront your own blind spots. You can't demand high standards from others when you're still justifying low standards in yourself. That's not leadership. That's hypocrisy, and hypocrisy, no matter how well dressed, eventually collapses under scrutiny. People may not confront it immediately, but they notice it. They adjust their behavior in subtle ways. They stop bringing you problems. They stop telling the truth. They start optimizing for approval instead of progress. That dynamic, once it sets in, is difficult to reverse. To avoid that, you have to operate differently. You have to train yourself to welcome feedback, especially the uncomfortable kind. You have to structure your decision-making around principles rather than outcomes. You have to build a habit of examining what worked, what didn't, and why, without assigning blame. You're not trying to be right all the time. You're trying to improve your understanding over time. That's how real leadership compounds. When people see that you're committed to learning, they open up. When they see that you own your mistakes, they take responsibility for theirs. When they know you won't punish them for failure if it comes from disciplined effort, they push themselves further. That dynamic creates momentum. And that momentum becomes the culture. Culture isn't built through slogans or mission statements. It's built through repeated behavior, modeled consistently by the people in charge. If that modeling is absent, no amount of policy will fix what's broken. Leading others is about creating conditions where the best ideas win, not where the loudest voices dominate. It's about asking better questions, not having all the answers. It's about encouraging dissent, not silencing disagreement. But again, that approach only works if you're strong enough to be challenged. If your identity is tied to being right, you'll shut down anything that threatens that identity. That fear of being exposed, of being questioned, becomes a liability. It limits your range, narrows your inputs, and weakens your leadership over time. There's no shortcut around this. You have to be deliberate about how you think. You have to build habits that expose flaws in your reasoning and improve the quality of your judgment. You have to seek out people who think differently than you, not to argue with them, but to refine your understanding. That process is uncomfortable. It requires humility. It requires discipline, but it's the only way to build leadership that lasts. The difference between those who lead and those who pretend to lead isn't visible in their words. It's embedded in their behavior. in how they make decisions, in how they respond to criticism, in how they allocate attention and focus. Those patterns reveal everything, and over time, those patterns determine outcomes, not because of luck, not because of personality, but because clarity always outperforms confusion, and principle always outlasts politics. Most people overcomplicate leadership because they focus on controlling outcomes rather than improving the systems that produce those outcomes. They become obsessed with metrics, deadlines, and optics, hoping to manage performance through pressure. What they don't understand is that control is brittle. It might work in the short term, but over time it breaks down. People don't operate at their best when they feel watched or coerced. They operate at their best when they understand the logic behind the mission, when the structure is clear, and when they feel ownership of their role in that system. There's a fundamental misunderstanding in how most people approach the difference between leading themselves and leading others. They think it's about scale. It's not. It's about precision. The same level of thinking that helps you navigate your own priorities doesn't automatically translate to leading teams. What works for personal discipline doesn't always work for collaborative execution. But the common thread is clarity. If you're not clear on what matters, you'll either get lost in the noise or start reacting to problems that don't matter. The ability to filter, to prioritize, and to stay focused under pressure. Those are transferable across both domains. And the quality of your leadership is tied directly to how well you've internalized those filters. Leading yourself is a matter of personal discipline. Leading others is a matter of systemic consistency. That consistency isn't built through force of will. It's built through design. You create systems, processes, and standards that outlive your presence in the room. You reduce friction, eliminate ambiguity, and increase transparency. But that requires depth of thought. You have to understand not just what to do, but why it works when it doesn't, and how to adjust it without breaking momentum. Shallow leaders can't do this. They rely on motivation, urgency, and authority. And as soon as those tools run dry, their influence disappears. The mistake people make is thinking that more responsibility means more control. In reality, the more you lead, the less you control directly. Your job shifts from doing to shaping. You create frameworks so that other people can make decisions with clarity. You create alignment so that your absence doesn't cause confusion. You remove dependencies on yourself, not to be hands-off, but to be focused on the highest, leverage decisions. That's a hard transition for most people, especially those who equate leadership with being the center of every decision. But if you're in the way, you're not leading. You're bottlenecking. It's also important to understand that leading others brings more noise into the system. More opinions, more egos, more friction. If you don't know how to process all of that information, you'll either ignore it or get overwhelmed by it. Both are dangerous. You need a process for listening deeply without being swayed emotionally. You need mechanisms to validate ideas based on evidence, not status. That's how good leadership decisions are made, not through instinct, but through structured thinking. And you can't get there if your identity is fragile or if you're afraid of being wrong. Leaders who don't evolve their thinking get exposed quickly. The environment changes, and their outdated models start producing bad outcomes. But instead of adjusting their approach, they double down on the past. That refusal to adapt is what ultimately ends their effectiveness, and often they don't even realize it until the consequences are irreversible. You can avoid that outcome by treating every failure as feedback and every success as temporary. Nothing is static. Everything is changing. The question is whether your mental models are evolving fast enough to keep up. One of the most overlooked elements of leadership is the ability to simplify. Complexity is easy to create, but difficult to manage. Great leaders remove clutter. They isolate the few things that really matter and direct energy toward those things with intensity. That simplicity is not a lack of ambition. It's precision. It's knowing that trying to do everything is the fastest path to doing nothing well. So you choose your battles, and you choose them based on impact, not emotion. Ultimately, the difference between leading yourself and leading others isn't about hierarchy. It's about leverage. When you operate with clear principles and a refined process, your impact multiplies. People begin to model your behavior, not because you ask them to, but because they've seen it produce results. That replication, when your thinking starts to scale without your presence, is when real leadership begins. Everything else is just noise.